Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Steve Levingston, nonfiction book editor of the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. First, a couple of housekeeping things. We'd like to extend a word of thanks to the festival's co-chairman, David Rubenstein, and the other generous sponsors who've made this event possible. And if you'd like to contribute your financial support, there is some information about that in the program. Before we begin, I've been asked to remind you that these events are being recorded by the Library of Congress, which may broadcast them at some future date. After our author's presentation, there will be time for questions, but if you don't want to become part of the library's permanent collection, it may be best to let someone else ask the questions. Now, many people have the look of brilliance. There are many people who sound brilliant, but few people have both of those qualities, and a third, most important one, they prove their brilliance. Steve Coll is that rare person. His works speak for itself. He's a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize, once as a reporter for the Washington Post for his coverage of the SEC, and another time for his book Ghost Wars, his account of the CIA's role in Afghanistan. Now he's Dean of Columbia Journalism School and a staff writer at The New Yorker. I was honored to work under him when he was managing editor of the Washington Post. Steve has written 8 books. These include an account of the breakup of AT&T, an exploration of ExxonMobil's power, and a history of the bin Laden family. His latest book, Directorate S, is a follow-up to Ghost Wars. It takes us into the aftermath of the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and the US experience over the next 17 years, which can be described, as one reviewer put it best, as a period of American ignorance, atrocity, and error. Reviewers have called the book impressive and definitive. They have noted the 550 interviews Steve conducted. They have praised his literary prowess. But the story Steve tells is a dispiriting one. As the New York Times wrote, the topic is important, the treatment compelling, the conclusions persuasive. But that reviewer, Andrew Bacevich, noted that America's policymakers are not listening and are not taking Steve's reporting to heart. Just don't expect anything to change, Bacevich concluded sadly. Steve is a force for illumination and understanding of America's past and present. So please join me in welcoming Steve Coll.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you all for coming out. I really enjoyed working with Steve and the fantastic colleagues at the Washington Post. I miss them a lot, so I'm always glad to get back to Washington. And also, I'm always glad to get back to a city that has so many people in public service and engaged in international policy, which are kind of my subjects. I wonder, just a quick show of hands, how many people in this room have been to Afghanistan since 2001 in service in one way or another? Yeah, a significant number. So, I have about 30 minutes to introduce the book to you, so I'm going to have to be efficient. You might notice that it's not a thin book, and so the way I try to give you a flavor of it is by giving you a sense of what it's about, where it came from, and what story it tells, but then mostly what are several of the most important themes in this history that I can try to draw out and give you a little bit of flavor for, and then I'll read a little bit at one stage as well, just to give you a flavor for some of the reporting on the ground, and then I look forward to your questions. So in February 1989, the final armored column of the limited contingent of Soviet forces in Afghanistan, as the Soviet occupation army was called, crossed over the Friendship Bridge of the Amu Darya River, officially ending the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan during the 1980s. General Gromov was the final Soviet commander, and he got down from the last armored personnel carrier and turned his back on Afghanistan and walked out and was greeted by his son, who gave him a bouquet of flowers. That was how the Soviet war ended. In December 2014, the Obama administration thought it was ending the war in Afghanistan, although it intended to stay and hand off support in an advisory role under Operation Resolution Support. But nonetheless, the United States at that time thought that its combat operations, direct combat operations in Afghanistan were ending, so they held a ceremony in a gymnasium in the bunkered and fortified headquarters of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan in Kabul. And they handed out, they had some military bands. But they were very well inside an area that they sometimes had experience of being rocketed in. So they handed out kind of a program for the ceremony that included instructions about how to get down on the floor and cover your head in the event of rocketing. So that was how the US war ended once, and then a year later it started again. And today, as you know, we're still actually in direct combat operations in Afghanistan. We're fighting two wars there, one directly against the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and affiliated groups, and then another, that advisory and assist war that we thought we were moving into in 2014. So it's been 17 years, a lot of frustration, a lot of sacrifice. Hundreds of thousands of Americans volunteered over the course of those years to serve in Afghanistan. More than 2,000 American soldiers died, as did hundreds of contractors. More than 20,000 soldiers suffered injuries. The casualties among Afghans and Pakistanis were even greater. The war that followed the end of the American invasion in 2001 caused about 140,000 deaths directly by the end of 2014, according to estimates by researchers at Brown University, and tens of thousands more since then. And of course, Afghans and Pakistanis have suffered the most losses, even greater losses. So why, over so many years, and despite so many efforts and strategies, has the United States failed to achieve its goals in Afghanistan? Has it failed to vanquish the Taliban, failed to stabilize the country, failed to create a self-sustaining, independent constitutional republic or democracy of some sort? It's a long story, it's a complicated story, but as I say, I want to draw out a few themes and tell a few stories around what I think are some of the recurring problems in the war. So the first is the problem of war aims. Why are we there? Which was a question that was, of course, never really formally addressed before we invaded Afghanistan, because the war was a hurried and improvisational response to the September 11th attacks designed to disrupt Al-Qaeda, which was in Afghanistan, and had carried out the attacks substantially from there, to disrupt their leadership before they could launch what was presumed to be follow-on attacks. And so the war never really reckoned with what Afghanistan after the invasion would be, because it was really being conceived within 2 or 3 weeks of the shock of the September 11th attacks. And so in the subsequent period, after the Taliban fell at the end of 2001, and Al-Qaeda largely escaped Afghanistan and migrated into Pakistan, the war since then has been plagued by recurring arguments and confusion over war aims. I want to talk about that. Second thing that has really been repetitive, although it was confined to the period when Hamid Karzai was in office, was the failure to consolidate a relationship with Karzai that would serve American interests in the transition to a post-Karzai world. We really lost our relationship with Karzai, and our investments in democratic Afghan politics also faltered, not only because of our conduct or decision-making. Afghans had a lot to do with that too. But I think the story of the failure of the relationship with Hamid Karzai is particularly interesting because it goes to the big problem of Pakistan. The biggest puzzle, I think, for a lot of people who served in the war, and certainly for a lot of Afghans throughout the war after 2001, and particularly when the Taliban started to revive around 2004, 2005 in seriousness, was why the United States and NATO were willing to accept the sanctuary and the support that the Taliban enjoyed, still enjoy, across the border in Pakistan, even when Pakistan was receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in US aid, and even after it became obvious that the Taliban were prevailing, or certainly working up a pretty bloody stalemate in Afghanistan because of the sanctuary and the training and the aid that they enjoyed covertly from Pakistan and from Pakistan's principal intelligence service, Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI. The title of the book, Directorate S, refers to the covert action arm. It's what the Americans sometimes called the covert action arm of ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service, that works with groups like the Taliban, related groups in Kashmir, to carry out what Pakistan's army sees as its foreign policy interests in the region. Of course, the Americans knew all about ISI because we had collaborated with them during the 1980s against the Soviet Union. Along with Saudi intelligence, we pumped billions of dollars into the Afghan rebel force based in Pakistan that also prevailed over the Soviet Union because it enjoyed this physical sanctuary and covert aid that we participated in. So why did we fail to recognize ISI's revival, and why did it turn out to be so flummoxing? Something we can talk about. All right, so that's the real principal narrative of the book. It opens, Ghost Wars closes on the eve of the 9/11 attacks. It's about the history between the Soviet invasion and 9/11, and this is intended as a second volume of Ghost Wars, although it's kind of a funny thing as a writer to write a second volume of a book that wasn't intended to be the first of two, but that's kind of what this is. And it ends where Ghost Wars stops quite deliberately and comes forward to something like the present day and has many of the same reporting and narrative storytelling strategies as the first volume. All right, so I promised to go over this subject of war aims. One of the things, I mean, I was kind of a beat reporter on the war after 9/11 because I had accidental expertise about Afghanistan. I'd been assigned out there by the Washington Post as a foreign correspondent. I'd covered the war on the ground long before 9/11, before anyone was really very interested in it. But it was I became kind of a professional obsession and a great interest. I loved the landscape and the people that I met in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I found the war and the structure of covert action that shaped so much misery and radicalism in the region to be an important subject and one that fascinated me. But after 9/11, because of that background, I kept going back to the region, Pakistan and Afghanistan, doing a lot of reporting. And I also was a creature of Washington, covering the national security bureaucracy and interagency debates about US policy in Afghanistan and in the war. And so when I went back to do the research to really excavate the history of decision-making in Washington about policy in the Afghan war and policy toward Pakistan, I was surprised and a little bit disheartened to encounter what I didn't fully appreciate as a kind of beat reporter, which is the repetitive nature of the debates about why are we in Afghanistan and who is our enemy. The Bush administration, through several phases, right up until the last days and months of the Bush administration, convened in a classified conference room in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, which is next door to the White House. If you're walking by the White House, it's over there to the right, that very ornate-looking building on the 4th floor. And they would typically spend a whole day wrestling over what direction to take in Afghanistan. They'd have the intelligence analysts come in the morning and try to brief the facts. This is what the map looks like. These are the principal ethnic groups. Here are the principal factions. And then they would leave and the policymakers would debate, and they'd get to these basic questions. Are the Taliban our enemy? There were no Afghans on the planes on 9/11. So far as is known, the Afghan Taliban have never carried out a terrorist attack as an organization against the United States in the US or in Europe. They were attacked initially because they were correctly seen as providing sanctuary to al-Qaeda. Their alliance with al-Qaeda was always uneasy and debatable. And so in these policy decisions, starting in 2006, repeating in 2008, and in 2009, and in 2012, and in 2014, the best minds in the US government, the best informed South Asia policymakers would return to this conference room, write up white papers, try to develop recommendations to the president. And one of the questions they kept returning to is, what are our vital interests in Afghanistan that justify the kinds of sacrifices that we ask young men and women in uniform to make over there? And an example would be, in 2009, during the first year of the Obama administration, new group came in, went back to the same conference room, picked up the white papers that the Bush administration had left behind, went back to this question, and they were clear-eyed about what the question should be. As taxpayers, you would want them to be asking, what vital interests really justify this kind of military sacrifice? And they worked on that for weeks and months. And in the end, they identified two. One was Al-Qaeda, which was still carrying out international attacks from the region against the United States, attempting attacks inside the United States, also in Europe and elsewhere. And the second was the security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, because Pakistan has about 100 nuclear weapons. It has a lot of radical groups on its soil, and the nightmare scenario would be if somehow Pakistan became so destabilized that these weapons fell into the wrong hands. But consider this contradiction, the first of half a dozen that we can review over the next 20 minutes. Neither Al-Qaeda nor Pakistan's nuclear weapons were in Afghanistan in 2009, where the president was about to send 100,000 troops. So if the vital interests are in Pakistan, why are we fighting a war next door in Afghanistan? The president and his advisors were smart enough to understand this is a contradiction, so they wrestled with it, and they said, well, it's sort of an indirect reason, because if Afghanistan falls apart, then Al-Qaeda will come back into Afghanistan, and that may also destabilize Pakistan. And so we've got to shore up this neighbor in order to pursue the vital interests that are next door. I don't know. I mean, as a parent, sending a child into harm's way, that feels a little bit indirect to me as a war aim. Well, the other war aim then that might justify this sort of sacrifice is you are going to fight the Taliban. You're going to prevent the Taliban from consolidating the momentum, which by 2009 it had quite a lot of on the ground in Afghanistan. But the policymakers, and including particularly during the early Obama years, were really divided about whether the Taliban should be understood as an enemy of the United States, partly for the reasons that I described. They're indigenous to Afghanistan, it was pointed out in these debates. They are part of the fabric of southern and eastern Afghanistan. They have not declared war against the United States. They're abhorrent, their ideas are abhorrent. We certainly don't want them to take power, but are they an enemy? The truth was that President Obama did not believe that the United States should attempt to fight a forever war against the Taliban, that there was neither the political clock in the United States, nor the resources, nor the prospect of military victory to justify such an endeavor. But his generals had sold him on the idea of a counterinsurgency war that could succeed in Afghanistan the way it was perceived to have succeeded in Baghdad after the surge there in 2006. And so the president was reluctant to, at least initially, that's a funnier conversation than Afghanistan. Let's make some noise in here. I'm sorry. People are... It's hard to get a laugh out of fighting and dying, but we'll keep trying. Anyway, there's a scene where the president basically makes it known through his White House aides that he doesn't want to try to fight this forever war against the Taliban. And so his aides go into this secure conference room or the Situation Room one day and they say, have we ever really said that it was our aim to defeat the Taliban? And the Pentagon representatives are appalled. And the next day they come back with a big PowerPoint deck that shows all the different statements that American presidents and senators have made about our intention to vanquish the Taliban from the face of the earth. They say, you may not want to fight this war, but you've said you've signed up for it. And so, yes, we have declared our interest in defeating it. But then when the troop surge announcements were made, if you parse that language, it's very careful not to declare that we intend to defeat the Taliban on the battlefield. The war aim was to reduce or reverse the Taliban's momentum, to create space for Afghan forces to take the lead, and essentially a kind of Vietnamization of the Afghan war. And that was achieved. It still has been achieved today. The war is a stalemate now, just as it was in 2007. one of the episodes the book describes repeatedly is these very popular classified maps that the CIA would produce called the district assessments, which were derived from a similar mapping exercise carried out during the Vietnam War. They would take all of Afghanistan's approximately 400 districts, administrative districts, and color code them based on the latest intelligence and open information as to whether or not they were controlled by the Taliban, controlled by the Afghan government, contested, or locally controlled by some other warlord. And essentially, they would come in and unfurl these maps, and everyone would pore over them looking for subtle changes. The reality is they haven't changed color in 10 years. They're made every 6 months, and things move around, and green appears here and red appears there. The war is stalemated, and it's stalemated because the Taliban have no Air Force, and they have no answer for the US Air Force. So they can't mass very successfully. But also, neither the NATO-led troops, which at their peak numbered 150,000 in Afghanistan in 2010, nor the Afghan forces, after we reduced our presence, has had an answer for the sanctuary in Pakistan, for the role of ISI in supporting the Taliban in the war, or for the Taliban's coercive control of quite a lot of rural districts, particularly in the south and east. Losing Hamid Karzai. Again, as a beat reporter, I'd covered Hamid Karzai for a long time over the years. I've interviewed him a couple of times, watched him, been to press conferences. He's a fascinating figure, and certainly was as he became the unexpected president of Afghanistan after 2001. And I thought I understood him reasonably well. I was aware, certainly by the time I was working on this book, that he had gained a reputation as being this very unstable individual who was constantly going off and attacking the United States and kind of involved in conspiracy theories and that sort of thing. And again, I was surprised when I kind of excavated as many of the private conversations that he had with his own cabinet or with the Americans, that he was very consistent over the years about one thing. Every time an American would come to visit him, he would say, "You're not doing enough to put pressure on Pakistan. These sanctuaries are unacceptable, and ISI's interference in the war is going to make the war unwinnable. Why are you not doing this? Why are you treating them as if this isn't going on?" And the Americans at first would say, "Well, I don't think you understand President Musharraf, who was then seen as a reliable ally of the United States. He's a friend, he's trying to do his best." Later, the Americans agreed that ISI was a problem, but they felt they couldn't put too much pressure on Pakistan because, after all, Pakistan itself was convulsed by internal violence caused in part by the migration of al-Qaeda into Pakistan. They had the worst domestic terrorism they've ever experienced in 2009, 2010. And if a vital interest of the United States was preventing Pakistan's nuclear weapons from getting into the wrong hands, you couldn't very well go in and exacerbate the almost civil war that Pakistan was experiencing at that point. Nonetheless, we kept confusing Karzai by kind of fluffing off his question. In the summer of 2008, then candidate Obama flew into Afghanistan on a campaign visit, and he went to meet Karzai and his cabinet. In this cabinet, really, they all didn't like each other very much. They rarely cooperated on much. But they all got together before the meeting and said, let's agree to emphasize to possible President Obama that it's all about ISI, it's all about Pakistan. So when each of them went around the table and said something, they all said, you really have to focus on this problem because the sanctuary is going to make the war unwinnable. And when the United States didn't do anything about it, worse, when the United States made it clear to Karzai that it thought maybe Pakistan was actually more important to the United States than Afghanistan, he understandably became deeply confused. There's a scene in the book where Vice President Joe Biden goes out early on in the Obama administration to meet with Karzai. The Obama administration came in, and a lot of administrations come in, no matter which party it is, they think whatever the last guys did was exactly wrong, so we're going to do the opposite. And one of the syndromes in this case was that the Obama folks thought that the Bush administration, particularly President Bush personally, had coddled Karzai, had spent too much time holding his hand, had accommodated too much corruption, too much drug dealing, and that it was time to get tough on him. So Biden was sent out to deliver this message. The era of the friendly video conference is over. You got to clean up your act, and you can't expect us to accommodate you the way the last administration did. So he goes into this private meeting with Karzai. Karzai starts the meeting by saying, Mr. Vice President, you really need to do more about Pakistan. You really need to do more about ISI. And Biden replies, Mr. President, Pakistan is 50 times more important in the United States than Afghanistan. So maybe not the most diplomatic way to put pressure on Karzai. But you know, in a lot of South Asia, and certainly in a lot of similar parts of the world, it's common to sink into conspiracy thinking. And the way it went for Karzai was, when he looked at the fact that the United States wasn't putting any pressure on Pakistan, and that Pakistan was, by the admission of many American generals and intelligence officers, that its role in the war was critical, he began to think, well, the United States must want Pakistan to be reviving the Taliban. He must want Pakistan to be destabilizing Afghanistan. The Americans must want this war to grind on so that they can justify having a long-term military presence in the country. This is the kind of confusion that you can create. Now, diplomat after diplomat, general after general would go to Karzai and say, no, Mr. President, there's no such conspiracy. We're just doing our best to try to keep this war going in the right direction. But Karzai was absolutely convinced that the Americans, after a certain point, were deliberately allowing ISI to create this war so that they could justify a long-term presence. At one point, a guy named Jim Dobbins in 2013, he goes out and meets with Karzai to try to talk him out of this idea. And he says, Mr. President, by now you've got the Snowden material, the WikiLeaks, millions of documents. Read them. Can you see any trace of this plan, this conspiracy that you're attributing to us? And Karzai looks at him and says, well, maybe you don't know the plan. Maybe you're not briefed. You know, there is a deep state in America, he said. Okay. A lot of the book tries to describe how these decisions cascaded, built one on another, how all these misunderstandings developed at the highest levels among decision makers in Washington and Islamabad and Kabul. But I also felt that I should try to write about the war as it was experienced on the ground, and particularly after the United States launched this counterinsurgency campaign in southern Afghanistan in 2010, 2009, 2010, 2011. It was a war, a very distant war, didn't get quite all of the attention. The reality of it, I don't think, quite soaked through. It was a volunteer army fighting in very difficult terrain. But it was the product of a kind of faith in counterinsurgency, expeditionary in counterinsurgency, as I mentioned, followed out of the perceived success in Baghdad. And if you were in town, if you were in national security circles in Washington circa 2009, 2010, it was like a bubble. It was like a Bitcoin or some other kind of sense, self-reinforcing sense that this idea is going to solve it. We're going to go out there, we're going to run this counterinsurgency campaign, connecting people to their government, walking through villages, fighting it out one path at a time. And it turned out in places like Kandahar to be a very violent war. And so I looked for a way to tell the story through one unit's experience in the heart of the campaign. And I chose the part of the campaign that was fought in the so-called Green Zone to the west of Kandahar, which is the Taliban's birthplace, significant city in the south of Afghanistan. It's called the Green Zone because though it's desert, there's the Arghandab River flows through it, and irrigation is made possible much of the year through this river, and the vegetation around in this green zone is incredibly thick. It's grape orchards with drying houses and berms, almost worse than Normandy in terms of terrain to try to fight in, and foliage that's almost jungle-like in the canopy that it creates. 10-foot marijuana plants being a feature of this big marijuana farming industry. One of the jobs the Americans had was to go out and cut down these 10-foot plants and then set them on fire, which was not always objected to as duty. But it was, the Taliban had been embedding in this zone for years and years and had built an incredible infrastructure, and the purpose of the counterinsurgency campaign was to go in and knock them out once and for all. So I'll just read you a little passage from that campaign, the flavor of it. So the initial phase of Colonel Art Kandarian's campaign in the Green Zone wasn't much different from that of the US Army in the American West during the 19th century. Build forts in Indian country and poke around. Forward American units detained suspected insurgents and used retinal scanners to log them into classified databases, but interrogations and human intelligence collection in Kandahar that summer rarely produced insights besides the known fact that many Taliban fighters were from or trained in Pakistan. So the platoons that I write about were former artillery units that had been converted to infantry because during this period of the war, the United States military was so stressed by the cascading consequences of fighting hard in Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time that they were piecing together task forces out of different units, and they were asking artillerymen to fight close infantry patrol wars with a lot of IEDs and implanted explosives. And this is, a lot of these artillerymen had been trained to fight with big guns on bases at a remote distance. They were engineers. They weren't used to this. So they would build these outposts in the middle of the green zone, barely being able to see 5 feet over the wall, and then they would go out and patrol on foot by contact, trying to just draw the Taliban into contact. Platoons depended on their most experienced sergeants to survive. Sergeant Josh Strickland had served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan before joining 3rd Platoon A Battery of the 1-320th, the Artillery Misfits. During the first couple of weeks at Combat Outpost Nolan, Strickland's patrols could not walk 100 yards without hitting an IED or getting lit up by Taliban from several sides. Listening to the enemy radio talk, they learned the enemy knew they were artillery, not infantry. In general, Strickland thought, the lowest-ranking first-time soldiers adjusted to the stress better than the more experienced artillerymen because the rookies had no expectations from prior deployments. Because of Strickland's experience and uncanny ability to avoid IEDs, soldiers continually asked him to walk point on their patrols. He chose to walk 10 to 15 feet ahead of everyone else so that he could carefully identify the best route, and so that if he did make a mistake, it would cost 1 life instead of several. He was ultimately wounded and medevac to Kandahar airfield 4 times. Each time, as he recovered in the hospital, a doctor would ask Strickland if he wanted to go back or go home. What am I going to say, he thought. He went back. Day after day, they shouldered their loads, stepped out on presence patrols, and hoped for the best. They walked past villagers near their outposts who were neither helpful nor hostile. One elder near Strickland's base kept a pigeon that he would let fly every time a platoon departed, apparently to let the Taliban know they were on the march. By July, IEDs and the escalating casualties had rattled even the most experienced infantrymen. Every soldier carried 70, 90 pounds of gear, water, and ammunition. They patrolled at night to avoid the sun and drank water continually to stave off dehydration. The IEDs were so thick around the Bulldogs encampment that they had to clear 100 yards at a time from the walls out. A lot of soldiers struggled with the stress. The 1st platoon of the 1-320th started out with 19 men. After 3 patrols, they had 6. 80% of Bravo Company's personnel had to be replaced during Strickland's tour because of combat deaths, severed limbs, concussions, or other injuries. Now, you think of those percentages, that sounds like Battle of the Bulge. Wasn't present in American life, that part of the war. And one of the reasons that I want to finish on, the last theme I want to touch on, was because we really didn't have a national debate about the war during the time that these sacrifices were being sought. And we also failed to reckon with the kind of political strategy that was necessary, given the history of wars of this kind, to really fashion any kind of exit from the war that would be sustainable. One of the contradictions that keeps recurring in the history is that every general who goes out to command, they command usually for a year at a time, maybe 2 years at a time if they stay for a long while. Every general who will go out for the American effort will say, there is no military victory possible against the Taliban. The only way this war will end will be through political negotiations and some kind of settlement. And yet, again and again, military action is resourced ahead of political strategy, and there is very little effort of a serious kind made to bring the regional powers, the great powers, the international system into a negotiation to stabilize the war. The book recounts this very interesting secret negotiation the Obama administration carried out with the Taliban between 2010 and 2013. It failed for a bunch of reasons. The Trump administration is trying something similar now. But it was always treated as a kind of Hail Mary pass and never given the serious international attention that, for example, accompanied the efforts to cap Iran's nuclear program with the P5 powers and Europe and everyone else involved. It's kind of a tragedy that we keep repeating the same strategy again and again and expecting a different result while asking for such large sacrifices from our own soldiers and those of our allies. Thank you for listening. I'll take a few questions. Thanks.
Thank you for your remarks. Really appreciated that. In your discussion, you talked about American aims. What about the Pakistani aims, and specifically Pakistan's interest in India and how that plays out in Afghanistan?
Great question. And it's a big part of the book. Short version, Pakistan's foreign policy and military policy is, of course, very heavily influenced by its army. So the outlook of civilian politicians is much less relevant when you talk about something like Afghanistan. And as you say, the Pakistan Army's principal concern is India, in which it believes seeks Pakistan's demilitarization or dismemberment. And the Pakistan Army discovered, with our help during the 1980s, that this asymmetric strategy of supporting Islamist militia groups against India in the region was a successful way for a smaller country with a smaller population and a less powerful economy to hold its own to deter India. And so that's been their historical strategy. And Afghanistan has been part of it, is why Pakistan was one of only 3 countries in the world that recognized the Taliban government when it ruled Afghanistan in the 1990s. They see India kind of using Afghanistan to sort of encircle Pakistan, and then they have a direct confrontation to their east. A subtler question is, why did Pakistan go back into partnership with the Taliban after 2005, 2006? Because for all of Pervez Musharraf's limitations as Pakistan's military leader and president, there was a period in 2002, 2003 where he was arresting a lot of al-Qaeda figures, cooperating a lot with the United States on counterterrorism, looking not to particularly get involved with the Taliban, I think probably just hoping they would fade away. But several years later, it became clear, first to frontline American officers and intelligence collectors, and then eventually to the whole cabinet, that ISI was back in action, that they were going back to the same old strategies they'd used before. And so why? Why did the high command make that decision 2004, 2005, 2006? It was kind of a mystery that I worked on in my research. I'm not saying, I don't think I've solved it entirely, but I think there were a couple of important factors. One was that the Pakistanis' sense of our involvement in Afghanistan and with them over the years is we're not reliable. We come, we go. We come in when we need something. As soon as we have it, then we go. And in 2004, 2005, we were off fighting in Iraq. And the Bush administration's view was that Iraq was the main effort and that Afghanistan was at peace. And they turned over security in the country to NATO allies and declined to resource a significant American commitment to the country. And so when the Pakistani generals saw the Dutch coming in to provide security in southern Afghanistan, and they saw the Americans concentrating in Iraq, they basically said to themselves, and we've seen this movie before, they're going home, they're leaving us with this neighborhood, and India's going to take advantage of this if we don't defend our interests. That was one reason. I think the second was, around this time, the United States did this big strategic nuclear deal with India. India is a natural 21st century ally of the United States in a lot of ways, and they wanted India to feel rewarded in strategic partnership. But they essentially said to the Indian government, we forgive you for having a nuclear weapons program, and you're now legitimate as a partner of ours. And we said to the Pakistanis at the same time, you're not getting this deal. You're not reliable enough. You give away your nuclear weapons through AQ Khan and so forth. The Pakistanis said, okay, you made yourself clear. India is your strategic ally for the 21st century. We're your rent-a-cop. You know, we're going to get after our own interests. And I think that's a lot of why they went back to pursuing the Taliban's revival. Yes?
Thanks so much for your presentation. My question is, do you think that the debate on this war and on many recent wars would be enhanced if we reintroduced the draft?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, you know, the strength of the American military as an institution, as a journalist, if you encounter it, you can see many of its great strengths, and they're rooted in the revival of a volunteer army after the debacle of the Vietnam War and the effects it had on the military as an institution. But I'm so struck at how segregated the experience of sacrifice has been in both wars because of the geography of volunteerism in the country. And I do think that a lot of the populism and the disgust that the country has expressed about its decision-making elites, particularly in some of the states and communities that volunteered to follow leaders into these wars, is located in a kind of uneven understanding of the failures of these wars, of the promises betrayed, and of the price paid, even where the sacrifice is seen as noble, the extraordinary price that is paid by people coming home with missing limbs and broken spirits from repeated concussions and so forth. So I'm personally, I kind of, it's not fashionable in the zip code where I live, but I think national public service is a good policy, and it doesn't have to all be conscripted military service to be successful. But these kinds of sacrifices should not be isolated from our shared experience as citizens, and they were in this case. Yes.
Your description of ISI in Pakistan makes it sound sort of, not to be facetious, but like the deep state of Pakistan. So, two questions. What is Imran Khan's relationship going to be to ISI? And secondly, coming back to Sy Hersh's alternative scenario for the capture, the killing of Al-Qaeda's bin Laden. Do you put any credence in that?
So Imran Khan is a really fascinating figure. I wrote a big profile about him in the New Yorker in 2012, I think, when he was first bursting onto the scene. He was a very entertaining person to hang around with and write about, so if you are interested in him, you can find that online. At the time, I went back and read it when he became prime minister, and I was surprised at that time. He really spoke pretty boldly about the army, which is not a thing to do in Pakistan if you want a political future. He was critical of the army very openly at that time. But I think he's seen now as having become a partner of the army. And the army has made a very clear decision, and it's an understandable one, that it doesn't want to rule Pakistan directly. The reputational costs, the institutional costs, the costs in the international system are high. Better to rule indirectly through civilian politicians who can deal with the domestic problems of the economy, of negotiating with the IMF, of all of the problems that Pakistan perennially endures. And so Imran Khan, I think, has been willing to cooperate or to share space with the army. There are debates about how much of a lackey of the army he is, but I think the record is he's stopped criticizing them, and he's accepted their clear kind of framework of support for him to take power. Will he be able to accomplish anything? I'm doubtful. And I think he might be able to do a few things domestically, particularly with his anti-corruption drives, but in foreign policy, clearly that belongs to the army. And if he tries to move in that direction, every civilian politician who has tried to challenge the army's ideas about regional policy and foreign policy has lost office in a coup or in a kind of indirect electoral coup. So he knows that history. That goes back 30, 40 years. Oh, Hersh's story. I mean, Sy is an American legend and a colleague and someone who I respect a great deal. And so all I can say is that I researched that same subject, and I didn't see evidence for the account that he obtained from the unknown sources, because they're just background sources. I didn't find those sources. you know, side, he does have a record sometimes of reporting things that couldn't possibly be, and it turns out it's true. So you know, in Pakistan, I'm willing to believe anything about Pakistan, but I really worked that thing pretty hard, and I don't see the evidence for those claims. Do I have time for one more? Wrap it up, I'm told. So I've got a card that says literally, wrap it up. So, well, you're gonna have the last word.
Thank you so much, and I want to apologize if I offend anybody, because as probably you can hear, I'm not from here. I'm originally from Poland, live in Canada now. So I hope my question won't sound like hostile. But I think, like, especially, like, I remember watching the movie Charlie Wilson War many years ago, and there was this scene when I think Charlie goes to, like, I think it was CIA or government, and he asks about, like, Afghanistan or, like, Central Asia Department, and there's, like, 3 kids from fresh out of college. And I think what really, like, considering the American involvement there now, like, I think sometimes, especially people from other countries, with all the respect for like soldiers fighting, American soldiers and Canadian soldiers and other countries' soldiers fighting and sacrificing their life, is there really like some kind of a government body that like has like a really deep knowledge and understanding of the area?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, I think expertise about Afghanistan and Pakistan was scant on 9/11, and it was a problem. There really wasn't anyone in the cabinet who had experience of the region first. I'm not sure that there was anyone in the cabinet or the senior ranks of the administration who'd actually been in Afghanistan as of 9/11. Colin Powell, Richard Armitage at the State Department knew the region reasonably well, but primarily through collaborating with the Pakistan Army during the first Gulf War. And so their perspective was very much located around the stabilizing force of the Pakistan Army. And that influenced some of the early debates. There were CIA people who knew quite a lot about the resistance to the Taliban because they'd been working with them. And they did get to the table and offered some initial advice. But as a broad matter, I think the failure to see ISI go back into action until it was pretty much too late in 2007, 2008 was partly a function of the lack of high-level understanding about the complexities of the war and the complexities of the region. A lot of it, more of it was about the distraction of Iraq, but I think that was a factor. And then, for those of us who had been working on this and were really engaged with it, it was frustrating sometimes to think that our government really didn't get it at some level. By 2008, by 2007, 2008, I wouldn't say that anymore. I mean, I knew enough of the people who were making decisions. The Army had been out in the field. You had people, multiple tours. You had a lot of Dari speakers and Pashto speakers going into the military now. You had a cabinet that had finally really spent a lot of time with this problem. And I think by 2007, 2008, the cabinet level decision makers, yeah, they did understand what the problem was. And I used to go around to friends in 2009, 2010, I was working down here at the time, and say, you know, finally, everybody in the system understands what's going on. The problem is that doesn't make it possible to solve it. Nobody, you know, that clarity has not produced insights about how to untie this knot, and you still see that happening today. But yeah, the expertise accumulated at a great cost, and it wasn't the expertise of a solution. Thank you all.